viewers, today we'll discuss the topic concept of below poverty line. Poverty reduction lies at the core of the global development challenge. While talking about poor, we speak extensively about assets that are important to them. Poor people manage a diverse set of assets: physical, human, social, and environmental. These assets include a broad range of tangible and potential resources, both material and social, that individual, households, and communities draw from in times of need or crisis. The four primary classifications of assets are physical capital, which includes material belongings; human capital, which includes health, education, training, and labor power; social capital, which refers to the extent and nature of social networks such as kin, neighbors, and associations; and finally, the environmental assets such as trees, forests, water, and non-timber products. Additionally, assets function at several broadly distinguished levels: the individual, the household, and the community level. Poverty never results from the lack of one thing, but from many interlocking factors that cluster in poor people's experiences and definitions of poverty. Let's talk about the concept of poverty line. We talk about poverty line on the following basis: absolute versus relative poverty. Poverty may be thought of as either an absolute or relative concept. The absolute concept of poverty refers to a standard of living defined in absolute terms. In this case, poverty is usually measured by the value in real terms of a given level of goods, ensuring some form of minimum subsistence. For example, the value of basic food or the minimum income required to have decent lives. The first attempts to define poverty as an absolute concept have taken into account the minimum diet cost, that is, the minimum cost for each household to achieve a given energy intake. This approach has two fundamental shortcomings. Number one, the minimum diet costs may vary among households, as they do not all share the same preferences of nutritional patterns. Secondly, non-food items are not considered. The relative concept of poverty, on the other hand, refers to a standard of living defined in relation to the position of other people in the income expenditure distribution. In this sense, poverty is basically a phenomena of inequality. For example, one could define as poor those individuals that have incomes below 50% of the average income of the society. Therefore, if average income grows because richer people gain more, people in relative poverty might increase. This concept automatically reflects changing social and economic conditions in a given country. The main shortcomings of this approach is that if poverty is defined as a fixed percentage of some synthetic indicator of the income distribution, for example, mean or median, then there will be no possibility to eradicate poverty unless the income distribution becomes perfectly egalitarian. Poverty is neither strictly absolute nor a strictly relative term. Absolute poverty concepts could also be adjusted for variability over space when comparing poverty across countries. Absolute concepts of poverty at a given time are relative to the prevailing economic conditions. Both the absolute and the relative concepts of poverty may be variable in time and space. Secondly, we consider poverty line basket. Determining composition of the basket is among most debated part of the issue. To make a living, people consume innumerable items. Apart from food, housing, fuel, health, education, communication, conveyance, entertainment, recreations are the things which are important. But whether they should be included or not, if so, their weights in the basket, whether health should get preference over housing or whether reasonable expenditure on recreation will be included in basket, etc., are toughest questions to be answered. Problem is that these are qualitative aspects which are needed to be quantified. Historically, focus of India's poverty line basket policy has been on consumption of calories, which was first adopted in 1970s on the recommendation of Alga Committee. It was believed that 2400 kilocalories in rural areas and 2100 kilocalories in urban areas was sufficient to give good nutritious health to citizens. Then while choosing a poverty line or developing a poverty line, we consider reference period. Reference period should be different for different category of items. During the survey of National Sample Survey Organization NSSO, workers are asked certain questions to households. Periods covered by these questions is called reference period. Care has to be taken that this period is representative of general pattern of consumption. If we take poverty line basket, it will cover food as well as non-food items. In case of food, expenditure is a routine and a month's consumption can give us data which represents general pattern. If we take consumption pattern of non-food items such as clothes or footwear, we can find that in a normal household, these are once or twice in year expenditure. If we take reference period of 30 days for these products, we'll find in majority of households no expenditure of these goods at all. Now the point is, why at all should we measure poverty? What is the need to measure poverty? Poverty is measured keeping the following points in mind. Number one, keeping poor people on the agenda. Credible measure of poverty can be a powerful instrument for focusing the attention of policymakers on the living conditions of poor and vulnerable. Secondly, targeting domestic and worldwide interventions. The second reason for measuring poverty is to target interventions. Clearly, one cannot help poor people without knowing who they are. This is the purpose of a poverty profile, which sets out the major facts on poverty and typically on inequality, and then examines the pattern of poverty to see how it varies by geography, for example, by region, rural, urban, mountain and plain, by community characteristics, for example, in communities with and without a school, and by household characteristics, for example, by education of a household head, by the size of household, etc. Probably the most important operational use of poverty profile is to support efforts to target development resources toward poor areas. A good poverty profile also makes employment targeting possible. The relationship between poverty and education is particularly important because of the key role played by education in raising economic growth and reducing poverty. The relationship between gender and poverty may also indicate another targeting strategy for poverty reduction. Targeting is also important at a worldwide level. Institutions including the World Bank and the aid agencies have limited resources, and would like to know how best to deploy these resources to combat poverty. For this, they need to know where in the world poor people are located, and this in turn requires viable information on poverty in every country. Thirdly, monitoring and evaluating projects and policy interventions. More generally, the third reason for measuring poverty is to be able to predict the effects of and then evaluate policies and programs designed to help poor people. Information on poverty is also helpful in understanding the politics of many government policies. By collecting information on households and their economic status, one can assess who uses public services and who gains from government subsidies. If programs are cut or there's a retrenchment of the public sector, poverty data provide information on the effects of these plans. Finally, evaluating and effectiveness of institutions. The fourth reason for measuring poverty is to help evaluate institutions. One cannot tell if a government is doing a good job of combating poverty unless there is solid information on poverty. When evaluating projects, policies and instruments, our concern is poverty comparisons. In this context, we typically want to know whether poverty has fallen, a qualitative measure, and by how much, a quantitative measure. Now let's see what the national and international poverty lines are. In 1981, more than half of citizens in developing world lived on less than $1.25 a day. The rate has dropped dramatically to 21% in 2010. Moreover, despite a 59% increase in the developing world's population, there were significantly fewer people living on less than $1.25 a day in 2010 than there were 3 decades ago, which is a good news. But 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty is still extremely high figure. So the task ahead of us remains Herculean. In many developing countries, poverty is measured on the basis of calorie intake. Changes in proportion of global population below poverty line. What changes were there between the year 2005 and 10? Between 2005 and 10, the total number of poor people around the world fell by nearly 500 million people, from over 1.3 billion in 2005 to under 900 million in 2010. Then looking ahead to 2015, extreme poverty could fall to under 600 million people, less than half the number regularly cited in describing the number of poor people in the world today. Poverty reduction of this magnitude is unparalleled in history. In the early 1980s, more than half of the people in developing countries lived in extreme poverty. By 2005, this was down to a quarter, and according to new estimates as of 2010, less than 16% remained in poverty, and fewer than 10% will likely to be poor by the end of 2015. The first Millennium Development Goal defines a target of halving the rate of global poverty. By 2015, we have halved the global poverty rate as per Millennium Development Goal. Over the past half a century, the developing world, including many of the world's poorest countries, they have shown dramatic improvements in virtually all non-income measures of well-being. like the global infant mortality has come down by more than 50%. Increase in the share of world's children enrolled in primary school increased to nearly 90% between 1950 and 2015. As shown in the table below, at the national level, 85 of the 119 countries taken as research see the number of their poor decrease between 2005 and 2015. 58 countries record drop in their poverty rate of at least 5 percentage points. We can see tens of millions of citizens escape poverty in countries such as Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Vietnam, Indonesia and Brazil. As shown in the tables and figures on the screen, for the past 30 years, the bulk of the world's poor, never less than 94%, has resided in three areas: East Asia, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, which illustrates the distribution of global poverty in 2005 and shows a roughly equal distribution between these three regions. With Asia's economic rise, however, the share of global poverty is falling sharply, leaving Africa responsible for growing proportion of world's poor. Between 2005 and 2015, Asia's share of global poverty is expected to fall from 2/3 to 1/3, while Africa's share more than doubles, from 28 to 60%. Poverty will thus increasingly be seen as an African problem, despite the clear progress the continent is now making. While poverty is becoming more concentrated at a regional level, the opposite is true at the country level. In 2005, half of the world's poor could be found in just two countries, that is India and China. By 2015, it is the top 5 countries rather than the top 2 that account for this share. Similarly, 8 countries were home of 3/4 of the world's poor in 2005 compared to 15 countries in 2015. 6 years ago, those interested in serving the preponderance of the world's poor could focus on just a handful of countries. But now the number of countries is much more. During the 10-year period we study, the number of poor in middle income countries fell at an average rate of 11% a year compared to a rate of only 3.4% a year for lower income countries. This suggests that the poverty in middle income countries tend to be more transitory as countries advance along their development path. A finding that makes strong intuitive sense given that many of the poor in middle income countries today are in countries that have just surpassed the middle income threshold by achieving strong and sustained economic growth. In contrast, poverty in low income countries tend to endure, with more than half of the world's remaining poor residing in middle income countries in 2015. There is a good reason to believe that a strong rate of poverty reduction measures should continue. Let's have a look at the population below poverty line in India. The Planning Commission released estimates of poverty for 1993-94 and 2004-05 derived from the expert group Tendulkar method in January 2011. Subsequently, based on the same methodology, the poverty ratio for 2009-10 and 11-12 were derived by the Planning Commission in March 2012 and July 2013 respectively. The estimate of poverty ratio and the number of poor at the national level for the years 1993-94, 2004-05, 2009-10 and 2011-12 derived from Tendulkar methodology are given in Table 2 as shown on the screen. The rate of decline in poverty ratio during different periods is given in Table 3. From the tables, we can find that Odisha, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Tripura, Uttar Pradesh, and West Bengal are the states showing extreme poverty in rural as well as urban areas during the year 2011-12, as shown in Table 4. Table 4 shows that Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, UP, and West Bengal are the states with maximum number of people below poverty line in 2011-12 as estimated by Tendulkar methodology. Let's have a focus of poverty and people below poverty line on China and India. It will be difficult for some to believe that China has nearly succeeded in escaping poverty. In 1996, the country was home to the largest number of poor people in the world. Consider, for example, that in the 3 years between 2002 to 5, China's poverty rate fell by 12.5 percentage points from 28.4% to 15.9%. Amazing. In this light, the further decrease of 15.6 percentage points that we project between 2005 and 15 does not seem so far-fetched. In fact, the World Bank's own East Asia and Pacific Department found that as of 2007, extreme poverty in the sense of not being able to meet the most elementary food and clothing needs has almost been eliminated in China. On this basis, it seems reasonable to believe that the country could effectively eliminate $1.25 per day poverty. Turning to India, more remarkable reduction in poverty and an even larger divergence from the World Bank's projection is seen. India could see a decrease in its poverty rate of 34.6 percentage points over a span of 10 years, dropping from 41.6% all the way to 7% between 2005 to 2015. Such a rapid decrease in poverty on such a grand scale and over such a short period would constitute an almost unparalleled achievement in history. Almost because China experienced nearly an identical drop in poverty a decade earlier in the 12 years between 1993 and 2005. China reduced its poverty rate by 37.8 percentage points. But is India capable of following in China's footsteps? With respect to GDP growth, there is a good evidence that India is already closely following the path China has set. The extent to which this growth will translate into poverty reduction, however, remains open to debate. China and India are very different economies. China's poverty reduction was driven by massive migration from inland rural to coastal urban areas. As labor transferred from an unproductive agriculture sector to a dynamic manufacturing base, wages and living standards rose rapidly. While India's labor force is undergoing a significant productivity transformation on its own, as its manufacturing sector begins to match the dynamism of its long celebrated information-based service sector. The country's economic geography is less dichotomous and defined more by the contours of its 28 states. To sum up, we can say that poverty is a multidimensional concept that speaks extensively about assets that are important to poor. Poor people manage a diverse set of assets: physical, human, social, and environmental. These assets include a broad range of tangible and potential resources, both material and social, that individual, households, and communities draw from in times of need or crisis. The four primary classifications of assets as discussed are there. All four assets should be improved considerably to bring people above poverty line. The measurement of poverty also varies from country to country and region to region. Despite all the variations, poverty of all types is a vice that need to be contained and eliminated to make the world happier. That's all for today's lecture. See you next time with a new topic. Till then, take care and bye-bye.